welcome you to the Art and Science of Construction Outreach, and we are very pleased today to have Michelle Perdue and Tim Beachy from Kitsap County.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the Washington Stormwater Center for having us today, and thanks to everybody that's here with us for sharing your lunch hour with us. Hopefully you're having something good while you sit and listen to us talk. Hopefully you're all here because you're interested in the art and science of construction outreach. If not, you're probably in the wrong spot. So without further ado, as an agency, our goals are usually pretty straightforward when we're doing a construction project. What do we really want? Well, we want to get the job done. We want to do it fast. We want to do it within budget. We want to get in and out of there so that we can move on to the next project. We don't want to have any conflict with the neighbors or with anybody that might be passing by. And sometimes we actually want input from people. The question is, what does the public really want? Should be easy, right? Well, maybe not so much. They want efficiency. They want to make sure that we're using all the tools that we can to combine our projects and get in and out of their way as quickly and efficiently as possible. They want honesty from us. And at the end, they really want to feel heard. So that makes project outreach a little bit like dating. We know how to do outreach for programs or to incite behavior change. And what's a little bit different is outreach for construction projects. Some of you might have dedicated outreach people and you know a lot about how to do behavior changes. Project outreach is a little bit different. We don't want people to change their behaviors in this case. What we're really wanting from them is for them to be happy with us, or at least not upset with us. You don't get a second chance to make a first impression, and it's just as important with our outreach as it is in dating. It's a relationship between us, our agency, and the people. It's based on communication, and it's comprised of good give and take. So how does this work in the real world? I'd like to introduce you to a tale of two projects. We had two projects that had similar goals. We wanted to provide some stormwater solutions in a neighborhood, while at the same time add some community amenities. Seems kind of like a win-win, right? Our first project was in a neighborhood called Cariotis. It was a moderate retrofit project which would have enlarged and upgraded one of our existing stormwater ponds in a neighborhood development. And as you can see there, we have some neighbors to the right-hand side and to the left-hand side kind of surrounding that project site. There was an existing stormwater pond, and the lot was kind of largely overgrown. What we did here was to take this project and include some public amenities at the same time. Some of the proposed options at the site were maybe some walk paths or seating areas. It also included some tree removal. In our toolbox, we used a letter to surrounding property owners. And I should note here that we had a little bit of a staff gap at that time, so we didn't have a dedicated outreach person on this project. The project was almost designed by the time we sent this letter out. It was a direct mailing, and it was to notify them of the project and what it would look like as it went along. Well, what happened? The neighbors strenuously resisted, and the project failed at this site. We had to choose an alternate site for it in the end, which meant that we largely had to start over. So our second project was a little bit more successful.
So Manchester, the goals of this project were a large stormwater quality retrofit improvement as well as roadway improvements and pedestrian improvements. It would be in 3 phases over several years, so the public would be disrupted with traffic disruptions over a several-year period. Parking would be disrupted for local businesses. And the community had also just come through about a 6-month-long stormwater improvement just up the street from them. So the table wasn't really set really well for us to come in there and do more disruptions for them. The other factor was, although none of our project team had been involved, about a decade earlier we had tried to do a portion of this project, and it had failed due to some public resistance.
So how did we go about it this time? Well, this time, faced with that previous resistance and faced with what we had encountered on the previous project, we had an outreach team. We used, as you can see, a whole lot more tools from that toolbox that were carefully chosen to fit this project. We did some research in the very beginning, we made a plan, and then we adapted it throughout the span of the project. The outcome? Well, we have a new community park. It has an area for farmers markets and for the citizens to have events, whatever they want to do in that central area. It has stormwater treatment for 90 acres of runoff area. And it's a new combined use technique that stands as a pilot project for other similar projects in the county. We're hoping to use this approach in other spots where we want to fit large amounts of treatment in a really small area. So how did we get there on that second project? How do we make this be a successful project? What is the art and science of making sure that our construction projects succeed? First of all, you need to decide how much participation that you really want from the public. This is a wonderful graphic that we've gotten from the International Association for Public Participation, and I would highly encourage everybody to go down to that link at the bottom and check out their website. They're a great organization. Some of their core values state that public participation is based on the belief that those who are affected by a decision have a right to be involved in the decision-making process. Public participation promotes sustainable decisions by recognizing the needs and interests of all participants. It seeks out and facilitates the involvement of those that are potentially affected by a decision, and then it communicates to those participants how their input affected the decision. When we started out with the outreach on the Manchester project, we looked at this graphic and we decided that we wanted to be somewhere in that top third of that scale. The bottom of the scale is just to inform people what you're doing, and they have no input whatsoever. The other end of the scale, as you can see there, is empowerment. That means we're going to take everything that you suggest and we're going to implement it as is. Where we fell with this project was somewhere between involve and collaborate.
And Michelle, if I could jump in here and just reiterate, as a project manager, where I might do bridges or fuel stations, whatever, it was immensely helpful for the outreach staff to help us determine how much input the public should have. We don't mind input in the right area, and they really, really helped us decide where that was appropriate.
Exactly. Thank you, Tim. So the first step that we took was to know our group. And here's your first takeaway message. And if you don't take anything else away from this webinar, write this one down. It's the foundation to all good project outreach. We might think that we know our audience just by looking at them, but that's kind of reading a book by its cover. The real messages and motivations are what people aren't showing on the surface. If we fail to ask our group, if we don't find out what their wants, needs, and concerns are, we might as well all be speaking a different language. Most of you have probably seen the Humans of New York set of photo essays, and if you haven't, you've got to check them out. They're really cool. I think one of the most powerful parts of that campaign is that you couldn't guess at the stories behind the faces in the photographs. Everybody has a story, and we filter what happens to us in our larger world through our own set of experiences and expectations. As outreach professionals, we can't guess at those intangibles. We have to ask these people. In order to understand someone, we have to find a place where we meet them halfway, and we do that by asking and by active listening. Find that sweet spot between your project and the public that surrounds the workspace by putting yourself into their shoes. So safety is an important consideration for most people. The history behind our Cariotis project is that if you looked back at that graphic where I showed you the pond in the middle of the neighborhoods on both sides, we had regular neighborhood housing on one side of our project site, and on the other side we had some apartments. What we didn't know was that there was some history between those two populations. And one of those neighborhoods really appreciated that our lot was that buffer and that barrier between the two. So when we proposed to put in that connector path between the two, they no longer felt safe. That was one of the major reasons why that project failed. On our Manchester project, when we talked to the citizens before we got into doing the design. One of the things that they mentioned was that they were afraid that a park was going to be a place where people could come in, they could hang out in the dark corners and potentially do bad things. So we addressed that when we did our design in several ways. We made sure that we eliminated those dark corners, or we discouraged people from going back into places that we didn't want them to. And we put in safety lighting. Your campaign might consist of door hangers, newspaper ads, and printed materials, but what are you really offering for somebody who doesn't read well? Have you ever thought about that? How about for someone that doesn't read English? Or for a visual or auditory learner? We all have different learning styles, and we tend to do our outreach in a way that speaks to only one particular type of learner. Consider how you'd feel to have missed a notice that all the cars needed to be moved off the street because you couldn't understand it and your car was towed. So when we did Cariotis, we sent that letter out and we missed some of those people, which is why when we moved over to our Manchester project, we used a variety of methods, as you saw in our toolbox, to target those different learning styles in different ways. Another thing to consider is special populations that might be in your project zone. So what accommodations would you consider making for somebody that maybe makes a daily trip to a mailbox that's located in your construction area? How about someone who's concerned about emergency access to their home at all times? What if you were a caregiver for a family member with dementia and you knew that the activity, noise, and change of a construction project in the street out in front of your home would confuse and distress your loved one? Would you want those people doing the work to know that? What would you want them to do differently? So we had a construction project at one time where we encountered a really interesting situation. We were doing a project next to some housing, and we had an elderly man whose mailbox was literally in the construction zone. What we didn't know in the beginning was it was his habit to go out to the mailbox every day. That was the high point of his day. He liked to be able to go out, get the mail, and walk back. Well, it was dangerous for him to do that in the construction zone. When we found that out, they actually set up a time and a situation where he could get out to the mailbox safely. They gave him a safety vest and an escort to go back and forth. So that's the sort of things you really want to know. Have you ever felt patronized or talked down to somebody who presumed that you didn't know anything about what they were discussing? And how did that make you feel? Some of the times that we go out and talk to people, we have neighborhood meetings, and we find out that we have a retired engineer in the crowd. They know a lot more about what we've presumed that they knew. How's your project going to affect the neighborhood as a whole? Are you impacting the perceived value of anybody's home? Has the project taken these things into consideration or gotten input from the property owners? What if a 3-story apartment went up in front of the home that you'd bought for the view? What if your neighborhood was rezoned?
So one of the advantages we had in the Manchester project is that it has fantastic views of Seattle and of Mount Rainier. So our project was actually going to almost be in place of a condominium that had been proposed at one location. So we came in that regard, positively. However, our infrastructure has height to it, so one of the things that we needed to really look at carefully was if we have vegetation, how high can it be? Because views are extremely important. But knowing that ahead of time made it very easy just to work our way through it by just acknowledging that issue.
This was a consideration that I confess that I had never even thought of, but over the Independence Day weekend, there were several messages that were circulating around social media from veterans that had post-traumatic stress disorder. They were asking that people restrict their fireworks to one day so that they could prepare themselves for the volley of sound. The noise of the fireworks triggered a great deal of distress for them. They weren't asking that people quit their fun entirely. What they were doing was asking that their neighbors keep it to one day so that they could arrange to be gone or be prepared for these loud noises. We often don't consider the repercussions of our actions in the greater context of the world. We have a job to do and we're paid to get it done. But how would a noisy construction project affect people like this? What if you were a shift worker and you worked during the day?
So one of the advantages that we also had on this project is a proactive construction manager. And so since these disruptions typically occur during construction, I think part of our outreach team really is our construction manager, because he's out there on a daily basis. If there's too much dust, too much noise, if they're working late or early, he has a good contact with those business owners and those local residents. So a little bit more than in the past, we are including our CM on these topics, and it really works out seamlessly.
I definitely agree. You know, we all know that old adage about not reading a book by its cover, but we often, when we're doing things, we resort to grouping by like, or using kind of a visual shorthand to define our audiences. The reality is that there's really only one defining characteristic to our audience in project outreach. This place is their home. Many work areas are somebody's home. We're inconveniencing these people, disrupting their routine, sometimes working in or on their property. The public has the ability to make or break a project, and that's something that's key for us to remember, is that when we're doing this outreach, if the public doesn't want something, they have a very powerful voice. The most successful projects take the public into consideration from the very beginning. So once we've done our homework and we found out from our audience what moves, motivates, and concerns them, then we can craft our outreach plan. This is really our roadmap. How do we make this roadmap? Well, we identify our key messages early. We make them short, sweet, and concise, and easily understood. Then we write our outreach plan. That's really the roadmap of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and a timeline for what we're doing. Could also include why one tool was chosen versus another. It's invaluable to have a document to refer to when you're in the thick of a project with a lot of moving parts, and you've got to make those decisions on the fly. It'll also give you a checklist of where you're at. It's the third week of March. Where are we supposed to be with these notifications? And think ahead. This is the Boy Scout motto, be prepared. If you miss that target with one approach, what's the next logical one that you'll deploy? Try to think out all the potential issues ahead of time. Ideally, you'd do this at a scoping meeting with your project team, where brainstorming can really get you those potential problems and solutions. Map out all of those roadblocks ahead of time and think out how that you would get around them. The next part is to develop your trust relationships. Well, how? You do that by identifying your best messenger. It could be any one of a vast bunch of groups. Could be your agency, could be your construction manager, could be your community groups or a representative in a community group, or as Tim mentioned earlier, it could be your contractor. It's really about positioning the right person in the right place to build that trust relationship. If the community is receptive, this could be your outreach person or your project manager. If they're resistant to your agency, or you have other barriers like language or culture, you might go to your community groups to find a representative that would be willing to act as your liaison for information.
Michelle mentioned several potential folks there, and I would agree with all of these. And in this particular project, certainly our construction manager during construction has been a great asset. But what's interesting to me is we did find that community group and that person within the community that was respected. And so even before Michelle or her staff were on board, that community member was part of an advisory committee for the Stormwater Division. That community member was a retired professor, well respected, so I chose for him to be part of our selection committee to select the design team consultant. And early in the process, I invited him to some of our pre-design meetings. So this actually kind of predated before our outreach staff had really been assigned this project. So we had a little bit of a foot in the door, and I didn't realize at the time how valuable that was, having somebody within the community in the loop that was respected.
Absolutely. I really think that was one of the key reasons that project succeeded. It made our outreach team's efforts so much easier to have those people that were advocates within the community. That brings us to choosing our tools. And it could be, and it probably will be, a combination of a whole bunch of these. You need to remember to account for different learning styles, and you need to tailor your tools that you pull out of that toolbox to the particular project and the people that you're trying to reach. Make sure you have a consistent message, because keeping a consistent message throughout your outreach is really important in building trust. It also helps to keep a consistent look to your outreach materials so people can visually connect the message to the project. As you can see here with that Manchester project, all of our pieces of collateral had that same light blue kind of oceany look to them.
Well, I'll just add right here, just by looking at these displays, and I pulled up my outreach folder today. The outreach staff did just an amazing job, and I kind of forgot how useful these items were. They would post these at the post office, at the library, at a kiosk down in the Manchester area. And so they made it very evident that we were actively engaged in the community.
Exactly. And they knew that when they were looking at one of these pieces, whether they got it in their mailbox or they were seeing it down at the library or in the kiosks, that we were talking about that project. And it got to the point where the more of these pieces that we put out, they were actively looking for them for information. We went so far as to actually creating a logo and website for one of the county's most visible and major projects, which was the Buckland Hill Bridge project. All of this outreach is branded with the same message, look, and feel. And we found that that was really crucial. The next most important piece is to keep a realistic timeline. Understanding that it's sometimes difficult to pin down an exact construction schedule due to extenuating factors like weather and job scheduling, it's still useful to lay out a general idea for folks of how they can expect that project to progress. If you don't know an exact date, let them know that. Then give them an idea of when they'll know for sure, how you're going to get that info to them, and where they can go for more information. As human beings, we are much more able to roll with that change when we can anticipate and prepare for it. Make your timelines realistic, and if they change, let people know. Which brings us to takeaway lesson number 2. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Keep your community updated. Respect their time and the disruption your project is causing in their routine. Let them know where you're at, what to expect, and how we can help them cope. One of the ways that we do that is to use a service called Gov Delivery. So off on the right-hand side here where this red circle is an excerpt from one of our project pages. And I'm believing that's actually the Manchester project page that we're looking at. You'll see that that circled piece says, click here to receive updates by email or text message. That is the link to our Gov Delivery service. And what happens when you click that is that it takes you to a sign-up form where you can choose to receive the most current information on that project, either by email or text message. You're basically subscribed to that subject. And right now, we have 246 people that are subscribed to that Manchester project. And every time that project page changes, every time something new happens, they get notified in the way that they've chosen. One of the other really cool ways that Gov Delivery ties in is we have this thing on the left top there called the Road Report. Our Road Report tells people, it's another subscription service that you can get to through the Gov Delivery sign-up. It tells everyone what our current construction is throughout the county in 3 general areas, day by day by day, and it's updated daily. You can see a typical Facebook post down there on your bottom left. When we do a Gov Delivery update, it also pushes it out to social media. So we're hitting all of these notifications from several areas. Makes Gov Delivery a really impactful tool. Right now, as I said, we have 246 people that are getting info on that Manchester project alone. We have about 450 people that are getting general stormwater news, and we have over 2,000 people that get that road report. So these can be really impactful tools for pushing information out to people. which ties right into our project website. We've made a great deal of changes to our project website over the last year, and we're very excited about that because now we can go to this little map that you see down at the bottom left, and if you know where your house is in that area, you can zoom in and you can see what project may be going on by clicking on one of those little green dots. It connects to all the county public works projects. It's not just our stormwater projects, but it's also the sewer and roads projects as well. Each one of those little green dots corresponds to a project page, which is the top right there. It's searchable by project name or by where your location is. When you get to the project page, it tells you information about the project, the timeline, pictures of that project, any associated documents like construction plans or renderings or notifications that you may have missed. And it gives a contact number for the project contact. We also use social media a little bit with our construction projects. We're just basically dipping a toe into social media at this point. We use it to push out some key information like interesting things that are happening on a project. That's what you'll see there at the top left. That is the spiral rain garden in the Manchester project being constructed. That was one of our most popular posts. It was quite interesting. The bottom left is a copy of an invitation to the public to come view the results of their feedback at one of our community meetings. And the right-hand side there was just an update of all the features as they were constructed. We also do boost our Facebook posts when we feel we have some important information to get out there. That's been really successful for us. And something that we're just starting to implement is to do some shared posts amongst interest groups and some of our partner agencies. We've also recently become aware that there are community group boards in some of our work areas. For example, on this Manchester project, their community actually has a Manchester group. So we've sent out information to that group as well. Another really cool tool that we've just started to use is these kiosks. The kiosks are something that we're using on major projects predominantly. It's a little bit of a new use for us. And they are magnetic boards that contain our project info, other updates as necessary. If we're going to have notifications about a community meeting or things like that, those are what we're posting in these kiosks. They go up at the very beginning of a site. They are updated as new info becomes available, and they're usually taken down when construction begins. And of course, we rely on a lot of print media. We use targeted direct mailing postcards for a lot of things. You see one of our general ones down there in the center bottom. We also use a lot of fact sheets for our construction projects. That's off on the top right. Basically, the information you'd get on there was whatever current was happening, project description, a timeline, a budget, and a contact number. It would probably also point you back to that project web page where you could get more information. And another tool that we've been using recently is a watershed newsletter, which is that Kitsap's Healthy Waterways. It contains several project updates within it. One of our best tools is our neighborhood meetings. It's kind of an unusual tool that we don't always think of. It's the value of putting a face to the agency. These neighborhood meetings, whether they're large organized groups like community councils or homeowners groups, or just informal meet and greets in the street with the neighbors, can put a face to the project. They go a long way towards building support for your project. When you're at these meetings, be real. Here's one time formality really comes at a cost. We're more likely to connect with and trust somebody that we can see and feel is real and approachable. And that's one of the things that Tim does best.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but anyways, these neighborhood meetings, and in particular in Manchester, they have a community group. It's actually an officially recognized group by the county, and it really has been a great resource. So they have a monthly meeting, and either Chris May, the Stormwater Program Manager, or myself, or sometimes both of us, have been going to their community meetings for the past couple of years. And We've developed a relationship with this group which has been helpful in resolving contentious issues, whether it be parking or noise or the features of the park. And so since they have a face and a name that ties to these disruptions or to these features, it's easy for them to contact us and get immediate response. So developing that relationship, although somewhat time-consuming, in the long run has actually saved us time and money. I've also been involved in just like one-time meetings, whether it be like for a small culvert replacement, meeting with the community. Those have been a little bit more hit and miss. If the weather's bad, nobody shows up. If the weather's good, it may be many. But going to these consistent community meetings that they hold for their own uses, it's a great way to update them and also get a little bit more of a variety of citizens, because folks go on vacation, then they come back. So it's been a great asset. The county does have these community groups in various parts of the area, of the region. So as I have projects in other parts of the county, I would start to interface with that group. Like I said, it's time consuming, but I think it does pay off.
Absolutely. I'd concur. I think that's time well invested. And in fact, talking about the Manchester project, stepping back to that just a little bit, I was out on site for a different reason a couple of days ago and meeting with someone out there. And as we sat there and were chatting, one of the residents came across the park to me, and she had several comments that she really needed to be heard. And she said, "Oh, I recognize you. I have seen you at some of our community meetings, and I knew that you were the person to bring these to." So I think there's a real value in connecting with people on a personal basis. And another key message here is be agile. If one tool fails, what are you going to choose next? Projects are really living things, and they're very changeable. Agility is really key with these projects. The power of a smile. We know humans are social animals, and we're evolved for group living. We're driven to connect with each other. There's been studies that have shown that people who've been smiled at by a stranger feel more connected to others immediately after the experience than people who've been ignored. You know, when we go out on these projects, your first interaction should be like an unexpected smile. If we have a positive interaction, we expect all of our following interactions to be positive. If you succeed with good outreach, your next project in that area benefits too. With each one of these projects, you're building your reputation as an agency and all of those positive associations. Remember that people remember your agency. They don't remember your division. You represent your entire agency when you're out on a project. So let's revisit Karyotis for just a moment. Going back to our two projects, let's dissect them a little bit based on what we've learned in the previous slides. What went wrong with Karyotis? Well, I told you a little bit about the homeowners on one side of the buffer and the homeowners on the other, and the history of conflict between the two. So the reason this was a problem was that letter, the tool was wrong. It was too formal, it was too impersonal, and it was too technical. But really what the problem was that we didn't find out who they were as people. We didn't identify that audience. We didn't really identify the barriers and impacts, which was that safety issue. And the project failed due to the adversarial relationship that developed due to that. An alternate site had to be chosen. And that cost us some time and money in the long run, and that's where you don't want to get to. So how about Manchester? What went right at Manchester? Well, the outreach came first in this situation rather than being an afterthought. Our outreach started before the project started. We had that active community member that was on the Stormwater Advisory Board, so we were already establishing that credibility, and he was involved in the project throughout the project's lifespan. We identified the barriers and impacts out there. We chose the right tools to get our messages across. We used the right people to be the messenger for those messages. And we spent a lot of time making sure that we communicated back and forth. Every time something changed, every time something was new. We communicated with them in a variety of different ways. And here's a snapshot of the toolbox that we actually used out there on the Manchester project. Let's touch a little more in depth on how a few of these tools work to our advantage. The very first thing we did out there was to decide what the participation level was going to be. Going back to that slide that I showed you with the 5 participation levels on the scale. We decided to hit the middle of that participation scale, involving, with some collaboration. We clearly defined what we expected from them, how their input would be used, and what the sideboards were going to be. We started with this big blank slate, and you can see that down there in the right-hand graphic. The green little boxes on there were intended to be the treatment cells, but all of that space in between, we didn't define that. We offered that up to the community and said, what do you envision in this space? What does Manchester need as a community? And we invited them to tell us. Some of the advantages that we had in this area was that it was a small community, about 5,000 people, had a couple of community groups that were already established, and that had a core of highly involved citizens. We chose to work primarily with one really involved community group, which was already that county-recognized group that Tim mentioned earlier. We really relied on visuals. Renderings and mock-ups have emerged for us as really valuable tools. We use them in our kiosks, online, and at meetings. They really go a long way towards alleviating concerns about how a project is going to lay out and how it's going to look. Because most people, let's face it, they really can't read those construction plans that we love so dearly. These visuals help the visual learners. They save the costs down the road on change orders. And people really need to see and feel in order to buy into any kind of change that we're visiting upon them. I listened to a great presentation about 2 weeks ago with some representatives from Seattle Children's Hospital, and they did one of the most genius things that I could have ever conceived of. They were building a new building. They were laying out a new surgical suite, and they had a design, and when they had questions from the employees about how is this really going to work, is this going to fit our needs, they scratched their heads and they said, well, let's find out. So they rented a big warehouse building. They picked up a truckload of cardboard boxes and cardboard sheets, and they literally built a mock-up of that surgical suite so that people could walk through it, they could see, they could feel, they could visualize how that was going to work out. And they actually identified some pieces in there that weren't going to work, but because they did that so early, they were able to be agile and to make those changes in the design. That's where I think these visuals and these renderings really come in handy, because you get an eyeball on that and people can say, oh, that's going to look fabulous, or oh, maybe there's a concern in this other spot that we need to look at. So moving right along with the visuals, one of the really cool things that we did out there with the Manchester group was in the very beginning of the design process, when we were offering up some public input, we invited everybody to come in and do a design workshop with us. We had some ideas in the very beginning, so what we did is we did up these mood boards. And as you can see there, they had general themes to each one. They had photos that gave general examples of different kinds of items within those themes. We posted them on the walls, and then we invited people to come up and do a dot exercise. We gave them a sheet that had some green dots and some red dots, and we said, okay, these things that you really, really like, we want you to put a green dot on. The things that you really, really can't stand and you don't want to see out there, we want you to put a red dot on. And you can kind of see where those dots clustered. We explained this kind of like Pinterest, ideas, concepts, and feelings.
So, Michelle, I have to admit that when I was at this meeting as an engineer and project manager, I was uncomfortable with these mood boards, but they were absolutely fabulous because I didn't know how to capture what the community wanted, but the outreach staff, obviously they did. So they took these things and got the mood or the feel for what the community really was after. And one of the benefits I was able to actually get my brain to comprehend early on was that by having a variety of pictures, they wouldn't hone in on one item. And that's a challenge we have had on some previous projects. If we have a rendering that shows a certain type of street light, and it's only one rendering, people tend to expect that type of street light. And the one advantage of this was it was general themes and moods. And from that, I think the next slide, Michelle compiled all the items that came back and what their priorities were. And once the design team had the priorities, it was relatively easy to incorporate those into our design. So the first one, there's two that tied for first place. We wanted open space, and they wanted a farmer's market. Those two kind of tie together because you need open space to have that farmer's market. They wanted styles that were complementary of the existing styles in the area. And so we could look at the waterfront park that was already established and try to gather some information or some styles from that. They wanted a rain garden, and they wanted to incorporate water features. Those were all items that we wanted anyway, so to have them confirm that was a good benefit. We had shown the potential to incorporate some seating into these big treatment cells. That was a priority for the community. And a little bit more, I don't want to say touchy-feely, but a little bit more difficult to design was the blending of the natural surfaces. And I think our design team was able to blend those natural surfaces together. But again, using those mood boards to somehow capture what they wanted was very helpful for the design team. Another item that we've had to be working on is these contentious issues. And what we found was that if we look at them very early on and think ahead and just go ahead and address them up front, even if they're just a hint of a contentious issue, I found it helpful to mention them in some of the monthly meetings. And then if it becomes an issue at that meeting, I would tend to put a hold on it and then commit to having another meeting where I would bring a subject matter expert in to actually discuss it. And I think the most contentious was our back-end angle parking, and we spent about an hour or two with our traffic engineer at a public meeting, and in the end, one of the citizens ended up saying, "I don't think you guys have a choice. I think you need to do that." And he was right, but it was good to have the community say it. So what the outreach staff did, and I knew it at the time, but I continued to be impressed with how useful this one display is. What they did was they took some of the photos from the mood boards and they put it on top of the concept drawing for our park. And each of those picture call-outs is an item that answers one of the desires of the community. So if it's a picture of a light, those lights are the lights that are down in the local port that the community likes. So we're using those lights to kind of match the surrounding community. Another concern was safety. So we're showing lights and how we're meeting their safety concerns. Blending of natural surfaces. So all those pictures and call-outs are responses to the community's desires. The next slide is just showing some of our activities during the process. We had a groundbreaking well before we actually broke ground, but it was a way to get the community involved. You also see an orange construction sign. That's kind of a minimum that we would do for a project. But I also found it very helpful because it's one of those items that the community is really the traveling public notices. And here are some of the final shots. The park still is under construction. We have received a lot of positive feedback, and I think one of the main reasons is, aside from being a perfect project, is that the community feels like they were a part of it. They could look at items in that park, and they will remember that having grass in there was a little bit of a contentious topic. Should we have grass in there or shouldn't we? And they know how we got there and why. So it's been a very fun project. We are just finishing up phase 1. Phase 2 is currently under construction. Phase 3 will be next year. But because the community has been informed, I think they're ready for the disruptions and they will be supportive.
And even though we gave the community a lot of power on this project with being able to influence the design elements in our project, We all know that with great power comes great responsibility. So use the mutt mitt stations on that brand new grass. We're also going to be adding some signage to this project to finish it up. So it is just about done, and it is turning out beautifully. So what are our lessons learned from our tale of two projects? If this was actually a date, how likely are we to get a follow-up? For Cariotis, probably not likely. But for Manchester, sure, here's my number. We have a number of other projects that are going to happen within the next year or so, including the next couple of phases like Tim discussed. But we think we've built a relationship out there in Manchester that can stand some inconvenience because we've built a strong trust base. And that's really the key takeaway from these construction projects. That's when you know that you've got a successful project.
Michelle and Tim, that was fabulous. So Annika asked, how did you do your social research, community meetings only, or surveys and focus groups?
Okay, we didn't do focus groups in this case. We did do the community meetings as we've discussed, but for some items, and one of the recent items actually was a survey, and we find that useful in some situations. We're at the point where we're naming this park. So our survey on suggested park names and then the vote on park names actually closed a couple of weeks ago. It just kind of depends on the information that you're eliciting. The surveys are really good for those short and sweet things like a park name, or if you're choosing between option A and option B. But for something like the big open-ended conversation that we wanted to have, that dot exercise in that community meeting was really invaluable.
Anne had a question about, is there any difference between messaging and outreach around an LID project versus a general public works project?
We tend to treat them very similarly. We're using a lot of the same tools, and it's all going to depend on the specifics to your project too. The specifics to your project and the specifics to your audience, I think, is the key.
Yeah. Well, I've also found that in general, the LID projects are a bit newer, and the concept is maybe old to us, but to the general public, there may be something to teach them. On my road projects, there are fewer new items, so I think the LID tends to get a bit more of a bit more attention. One other thing that I've learned just in general on the public outreach, I had a floodplain restorations culvert replacement project, and we were excited about involving the community. We had a community meeting. What I learned over the years was that who I really needed to have there were the 5 property owners whose property I would be on to do the project, and half of those owners didn't show up, and so I needed to engage them, and engaging the community, while that was good, it may have been too early. So I think knowing your audience and who you really have to satisfy and get those easements from is really important.
We want to thank Michelle and Tim again for a fabulous presentation. It was very, very good.